Welcome all. It is very nice to have you both here today. And before start, I will shortly announce some points in Turkish. Bugün hepiniz hoş geldiniz. Öncelikle bu üçüncü keynote oturumuna. Bugün Richard ve Hugh'la birlikte olacağız ve kendilerinin konuşmalarından sonra üçüncü bölümde bir soru cevap bölümümüz olacak. Bütün bu oturumu odamızın YouTube kanalından Türkçe takip edebileceksiniz. Aynı zamanda orijinal dille de yayın yapılıyor zaten. Hepinize güzel bir oturum diliyorum. Bundan sonra bu oturumun bu kısmı artık İngilizce devam edecek. Yes, I would like to start with introducing our guests here. This evening, we have gathered in third and last keynote of 9th Planning Congress of Turkey, hosted and organized by Yıldız Technical University and Chamber of City Planners. As you all know, our Congress theme is the past experience, the current context, and the future horizons of planning, like yesterday, today, and tomorrow. This is our honor to have both of you in this Congress, and very happy to welcome you. The colloquium has been organized 45th time and 8 November World Town Planning Day. And this Congress is the greatest get-together of the planning community of Turkey. And because of the recent pandemic measures, the Congress has planned online, but even in online, it is glad to see you here, to have you here. Our keynote speakers, Professor Hugh Thomas and Richard Gale, have brought our attention to race, faith, and urban diversity in planning with their speeches, and they will share these important topics with a critical race theory perspective. And I would like to continue with the introducing our guests. And let me first introduce myself. My name is Erhan Kurtarır. I am working for Yıldız Technical University at the Department of City and Regional Planning as an assistant professor. And Hugh Thomas is honorary professor in the School of Natural and Built Environment, Queen's University Belfast. He has researched and written about planning in racialized societies for 30 years. His work has been published in many international top journals, and his other current research interests are aspects of planning theory and planning education, in which he has also published widely. And our second guest is Richard Gale. Dr. Richard Gale is a senior lecturer in human geography in the social geography and planning at Cardiff University. Richard has researched extensively on the relationship between ethnic and ethno-religious diversity and local authority planning. In particular, he has a long-standing interest in the relationship between planning and the special politics of religious minority identity, on which he has published widely over the last 2 decades. And also Richard is leading Faith and Place Network with Andrew Rogers, and has participated in several consultancies on the theme of faith and planning under Commission to Central, Local, and Developed Governments in the UK. And these 2 academicians have produced very original and important studies and have signed works that paved the way of the planning profession. And their contribution is very huge on my PhD, so I influenced by their studies and works too much. Because of that, they are my friends and they are my teachers also during my academic way. And today, Richard will start with a presentation, and he will have 30 minutes, and then Hugh will share his speech after Richard's presentation. At the last part, I will share comments and questions of audiences with our guests. Please share your questions and comments during or after the speeches of our guests on YouTube channel. I will share your contributions with the help of our translators. Now we can start if Richard is ready now. The floor is yours, Richard.
Thank you so much. Thanks very much indeed. And thanks hugely for the generous introduction and for the invitation to us both. And I'd like to just to mirror back to you the warmth. You're a great friend, Erhan, and it's great to be with you. And sorry we're not there in person, but another time perhaps. So I'm just going to share my screen, and I hope everyone can see it. Is that clear? Great. Okay.
Yes.
So what I'm going to do then, I'm going to try and keep to time, but I'm going to talk to this theme of faith, urban diversity and planning, a critical race theory perspective. I'm going to just outline it now briefly. So there'll be 4 parts. I think it's important to just to start with first principles. So I'm going to talk about the key ideas of race, racialization, and critical race theory in the British context. I make no assumptions about how much people know about British society. I don't want to overload it. At the same time, to make it intelligible, it's important to start with this year, and hopefully that will set us up for discussion. But it's really looking at how critical race theory can, and we argue should, be applied to the substance of planning in the British context, and then some tentative conclusions linking to what Erhan said before about pointing to the future. How might we carry over a critical race theory perspective into making our cities and our planning for cities more inclusive and more just? You've already given this very generous introduction, so I won't labour this, but I'll also acknowledge Hugh as a friend and mentor to me. I wouldn't be here if not for Hugh. My work reflects his work, and I've just been very privileged to allow my work to conjoin with his in a confluence. So I'm also in a position of student and vis-a-vis a teacher. So I'm very grateful for that relation to be acknowledged at this point in the presentation. If you do want to contact us, our emails are there. Erhan, I guess these slides will be available if anyone wants to follow up by email. Very happy to hear from you. So then, just to give an overview of the argument, as I said, we're using this idea of race. I'm not going to make any presumptions about how it travels. It could be taken up in the Turkish or other contexts, but it does lend itself to being tacked down in general terms and in relation to British society. I'm using it at this point in quotation marks. Race is a social construct. We're not giving any scientific basis. It's not grounded in any kind of biological or genetic terms. Its ontology is linked to its being a social construct. We use it in terms of how it denotes racial thinking and racial behavior, the way in which people in societies like Britain behave as if race does exist, and they treat people as if they are members of particular racial groups. Racialization then denotes the way in which the category of race is created and recreated, and the way in which it becomes enmeshed in our institutional and wider social and political lives. It's a process of becoming. It's being recreated in very mundane as well as palpable and observable ways. It insinuates itself into all areas, we argue, of social and political life. And it also becomes enmeshed in the way in which our key institutions, by which I mean also our state institutions, function. Institutions, including planning, have a key stake in processes of racialization, both recreating patterns of racialization, but also in an aware way in tackling it, in trying to overcome it and to de-racialize. So it's appropriate that we talk about the state and state functions, and that's clearly what we're doing when we talk about planning. Critical race theory is a specific theory that builds upon these ideas of race as a social construct and racialization. It's not the only approach or theoretical approach that builds on these foundations, and it is contested. Not everyone commits who is anti-racist to a critical race theory perspective. But we have found it useful and powerful, as we'll come on to in later sections of this presentation. It emerged in the US in the context of the civil rights movement, but actually what were perceived by critical race theorists as the failure of the civil rights movement in the 1960s to fully transform American society in a way that would create equal and fair opportunities for African American vis-a-vis their white American counterparts. And what they argued for is a more thoroughgoing transformation of institutional life in the US, to go beyond surface level legalistic changes, a much more radical transformation of our institutions, to fully deracialize them. It's a very powerful argument, and I say it is contested, but it's one that we adopt and localize in the British context. We've not met with controversy yet. Maybe this will be the first outing of that. It manifested in this book. So the book, recently published, I mentioned before, Race, Faith and Planning in Britain, adopts this approach. Actually, we started out, just to give us a bit of the history, writing a book that would be the second edition of Hugh Thomas's Hugh's Race and Planning UK Experience book, published in 2000. And like our book, this was a study that tried to investigate the role of racialization and racial ideologies in broad areas of social life in Britain, but also how it was implicated, how race and racialization were implicated in relation to planning. So we've taken up that mantle. We actually thought we were going to do a second edition of that book. Actually, we wrote a very different book, and the reason we did that was because of what we encountered in our analysis and in our review. So still taking on that mantle, that approach of looking at planning in a racialized society, but we needed a more powerful explanatory approach to capture, I'm giving the game away, what we saw as a pattern of reversal, a pattern of anti-racist approaches being, if you like, left in neglect, and generally a resurgence of racialized themes in planning and in wider British society. So we adopt the same approach, but we've also extended it using critical race theory to try and understand why planning seems not to have continued with an earlier, what seemed like an earlier commitment to an anti-racist agenda. I need to say a little bit about the history of race in the British context. I'm not going to dwell on it at great length, but it's really just to set up an arc, if you like, of historical movement and change in terms of race, particularly in the post-war period, the post-Second World War period in the UK. We could say much more. And Britain, of course, is hugely implicated in the history of empire and colonialism, and that's very, very important for this history. But its periodization is important in terms of the Second World War. It's the moment when Britain very largely lost its empire and its position in global affairs as an imperial state. It's also the moment at which Britain began to experience migration, mass migration. So in the post-war reconstruction period, Britain had labor shortages, and it actively promoted the migration of labor migrants from former colonial territories, particularly in South Asia, so India, Pakistan, East and West, and East then becoming Bangladesh in 1971, to supply labor shortages. So it was a period of rapid demographic change, and a period when Britain began to kind of really substantially pluralize in terms of its cultural and ethnic makeup. It's also then the period that we begin to get restricted migration laws that try to respond to alarmism, popular alarmism about the extent of migration in this period, albeit having been encouraged by the British state, which not only restricts the numbers of people moving into Britain, but also redefines what it means to be British. Migration law actually drove radical redefinition of what it means to be British, from a very capacious definition at the end of the Second World War, which recognized the citizenship of members of the colonies or the Commonwealth as British, to being a much more narrow and much more racialized definition. And that's happening with migration laws throughout the 60s and into the early 1970s. A period then of great change, and the rise of popular and fostered state racism. We start to see some progressive change. So there is. Is that a question there, huh?
No, there isn't.
Oh, okay, sorry. I thought it was a question. Okay. So subsequent to that, we start to see some progressive change. It does link to party political change. It tends to be under Labour governments that you see, for example, anti-racist legislation being brought in the 1970s, reformist agendas, for example, in the police force, a recognition of the existence of something we can call institutional racism. That means not just overt episodic manifestations of racism, but patterns of recreated disadvantage experienced by people of minority post-migration backgrounds. But by the end of the century, by the end of the 20th century, by the year 2000, you're seeing a kind of, it's been a gradual process, but some kind of sea change, some recognition of Britain's diversity, some celebration of its diversity, some tentative movement towards recognizing Britain as a multicultural society. Again, this is happening particularly under New Labour. And this is the period in which I was doing my initial research, and also in which he was publishing his book, acknowledging tentatively some of this change. What happens subsequently is a reversal. We have the race riots, as called, in 2001 in Northern England, September the 11th, which raises generalized concerns not only in Britain but elsewhere also about religious and particularly Muslim radicalization, and a jettisoning of previous commitments to multiculturalism, and a kind of new emphasis upon minorities assimilating to British, so-called British values and British culture. It's been even more intensively racialized in Britain in terms of the lead up to and the impact of Brexit. It's known that Brexit has licensed, or seems to have licensed, xenophobic and racialized language and behavior, and not only towards EU migrants, but to other racialized groups as well. There's evidence that the longer existing migrant groups have also experienced heightened racism as a result of Brexit. And there have also been, there's been another round of restrictive migration policies and the explicit designation of a hostile environment. That's not just a term of abuse. The Home Office has actually coined the phrase hostile environment to try and discourage illegal immigration into Britain, but it's also had impacts upon long-standing migrants and minorities in the UK context. So then this is the arc. There's been this a period of change, of popular and then state-fostered racism, some anti-racist reaction to that, which did have substantial material effects and seemed to be of long-lasting impact, but which seems to have been reversed and recanted on to some extent. And that seems that reversal seems to be broadly the story of the last 20 years. In terms of planning, it very much mirrors that arc. So planning in the period down to the late 70s was broadly an institution in denial. Planning was about the physical environment, it was about amenity, really didn't have much of a social project, and clearly therefore didn't have much to say about issues of race, racialized disadvantage and anti-racism. But partly because of the impact of anti-racist legislation that put an incumbency on public authorities, including planning, also because of criticisms of planners around their non-response to the racialized inner city conditions that many post-migration minorities lived within, which experienced riots in 1981 in London, in Bristol and in Liverpool. You see the emergence of a planning response. There was an important report in 1983 by the Royal Town Planning Institute, the chartering body of planners, in partnership with the Commission for Racial Equality, which starts a discourse, an important discourse about planning and its implications for race and anti-racism. Again, down to the end of the century, down to the year 2000, there are important surveys and reviews. Again, Hugh was involved in some of those very, very important studies, assessing the sensitivity of planning to issues of race and racialized disadvantage, and how far those messages around planning as an agency of change around race had been internalized. And those seem to be positive. They seem to point in a direction of progressive travel. But again, reflecting the timeline I set out before, from 2000 onwards, it goes into abeyance. It falls largely and loudly silent. There are some hints in various surveys that refer to social diversity, but in a much broader way, not to cultural and ethnic diversity, and a study of public bodies implicated in physical regeneration, around the implications of physical regeneration for racial equality, but very few and far between, and not amounting to the, not reflecting the previous energy of the decade or so before. As such, then, in broad terms, the race and planning agenda, if we can call it that, follows a similar trajectory of denial, of inaction, but then subsequent neglect to the wider politics of race in Britain. And this is the kind of point, or the series of points we make in the book. I won't labour the point here. I've kind of covered these already, but we argue then that countering racism runs against the grain in many ways of how a country like Britain, with all its imperial and post-imperial legacies, is organised economically, socially, and politically. It's not easy going. The institutional arrangements are stacked against that kind of agenda. It involves, the second point, confronting long dominant, albeit not unchallenged, perceptions of what Britain is, again with regards to its history and its changing geopolitical roles. That we've never properly overcome that legacy of empire. It infects many of our institutions, including planning. Race then is a significant social category in day-to-day interactions. It's not ephemeral. It's not superficial. It's deep-veined and enmeshed in the very lifeblood of British society. We also talk about faith and other groups. Part of this goes all the way back to the start of the presentation. When we talk about race as a social construct, because we're not grounding it in biology or genetics, it also we can also use that approach to conceptualize how cultural groups are racialized, are tainted with stigma, and positioned in positions of racialized power hierarchies. And my work, particularly around faith, around Islam and Muslims, but also other South Asian diaspora groups, reflects a pattern of religious racialization. Hugh's work on the Gypsy Travellers also reflects a pattern of racialization of that group. In part because of their ethnic origins, but also because of their chosen life patterns vis-a-vis wider British society. All of these then have implications for planning policy and practice, which we argue have been persistently overlooked. Not sure I'm doing for time, actually. I haven't checked on the clock, but I just want to say a few things about demography. I'm not going to labour this. Britain has been over that post-war period a place of net inward migration. This just shows that from the census years. One of the good things about Britain is it does collect good social statistics. The categories are crude, but if we didn't have the categories, we wouldn't be able to engage in these kinds of discussions. We might pick this up in the discussion afterwards, but broadly, it's a good thing that we do collect statistics in the name of migration and in the name of ethnicity and religion, which were instituted precisely so we could monitor in the image of anti-racist legislation. You can track that all the way back to the 1976 Race Relations Act. In short, Britain has been and remains a destination of net inward migration, and this uptick in that is just about the so-called foreign-born population within Britain. Of course, not less important, perhaps more important over time, are the descendants, that the British and British-born descendants of migrants. And Britain is increasingly diverse because of the youthfulness of those post-migration populations. So just looking at the key categories here, between 2001, 2011, 85% increase in the mixed ethnic group, 85% increase in the Asian British group, 64% increase in the Black British group. And we would expect that to continue for some time until that normalizes as the population pyramid normalizes and becomes more like the wider population structure. Very urban. Again, just the social geographer hat on. Much of the concentration of post-migration minority groups, racialized groups, reflects the initial pattern of immigration in London, in the Midlands, particularly the East and the West Midlands, Birmingham and Leicester, and the old mill towns and cities of the Northwest, Bradford, Burnley, Oldham, Manchester. And then finally, religion, because we talk about it extensively in the book, and it's an important case study for us. Again, extensive growth, particularly for the Muslim population. 75% increase from the 2001 to 2011 censuses, from 1.5 million in 2001 to 2.7 million in 2011. And other groups have also grown substantially. Over the same time period, the Christian population fell for a variety of reasons, partly to do with aging, partly to do with identity switching, people actually giving up their Christian identity between the censuses. But actually that masks a pattern of growth also in terms of racialized groups and ethnicity. So if you cross-tabulate between ethnicity and religion, you'll find that Caribbean Christians, African Christians, and Asian Christians grew substantially in that intercensal period. Again, that complements the story about Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus from the previous slide. Huge change, massive change. And of course, this traces back to that period I was talking about before in terms of post-war migration and Britain becoming a multi-ethnic, de facto multicultural society. So moving then briefly to some case studies. What are the implications of all this for planning? Well, they're huge, and we argue they require much more extensive consideration. The first case, many ways I could illustrate this, but let's use a graph or a chart. Is the racialization of the urban. There's been a discourse about segregation in Britain as elsewhere, where in other societies that experience much migration and settlement. Segregation has been falling. That's measurable and known. So some of the alarmism about segregation in the UK context is misplaced. But nevertheless, there is a persistent, obdurate correlation between residential concentrations of minority racialized groups in Britain and patterns of multiple material hardship. One way of reflecting that is what we've done here. We've organized the geography of England and Wales into deciles, into 10% areas of graded deprivation. Multiple deprivation meaning access to housing, access to jobs, access to education, and a couple of other indicators as well in a combined index measure of multiple deprivation by area, by geography. Organizing that into deciles and then looking at the concentration of different groups across those deciles, comparing against the white British comparator group, which you can see at the bottom is relatively evenly distributed across those deciles. You see some substantial contrasts. So starting with the Bangladeshi group, 65% of British Bangladeshis live in the worst decile of deprivation. 58, getting on for 60% of British Pakistanis live in areas of the worst, highest deprivation. High proportions of the Black Caribbean, Black African, Black other populations, and even the British Indian population. The British Indian population, along with the British Chinese population, are often celebrated as communities that have substantially, suburbanized, have been successful in professionalization and so on. They still experience an ethnic penalty, to use that phrase of Anthony Heath, and that's clearly reflected in geography. There's still getting on for 2/5 of that population that are in the worst decile of deprivation. This is not discussed. You will find an absence in terms of looking at planning discourse around this, even though, of course, this is very, very important to planning. It'll make it into policy documents here and there instantially, but there's no substantial discussion of this in terms of its impact in relation to planning. A second case, I'm just going to introduce this and then pass to Hugh in the discussion, because this is very much Hugh's area of expertise. But I mentioned before, the Gypsy Traveller group have had a long enduring exposure to racism in Britain and elsewhere for their seeming rejection of some of the central tenets and pillars of capitalist modernity. They resist assimilation. They pursue a life world that is in sharp contrast to some of the assimilative pressures of advanced capitalist societies in terms of acquisition of jobs, of education, and even what we might call economic activity. So, and they are heavily stigmatized. They've been exposed to persistent racialization. Now, again, going back to that time period I discussed before, down to the year 2000, again, very much under New Labour. I'm not singing the praises of New Labour and the things I'm saying, but there just is this party political tendency at work behind some of the things I'm saying, that there was a commitment to recognising Gypsy travellers as a group. They are now recognised as a group in the census, but recognising their legitimacy as a group with particular cultural needs and spatial needs. They were given commitments by governments at different scales, national, UK level, but also in the devolved environments of Wales and Scotland, to improve the sites where they could set up, like the one in the image, the camps that they could set up. And funding was also available to help them develop these camps. However, from 2010 onwards, it's been a very different story. So under the coalition government, the UK coalition government, the coalition of the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats, provision for grants have been discontinued. And then under Conservatives from 2015 onwards, there's been financial support has been entirely withdrawn, and there's been an emphasis upon Gypsy traveller groups having to comply with planning regulations in exactly the same way as any other applicant. No differentiation of policy making that recognises them as a cultural group with specific needs. Again, that pattern of that story of reversal. And then this has been the main topic of my research over several years. Again, reflecting that same timeline trajectory. So in the 1970s, I'm actually working across the slide here in terms of these images. They are in historical order. In the 1970s, when you began to see communities, Muslim communities in this case, in different cities in Britain, moving out of informal premises, converted with or without planning permission, shop fronts, dwelling houses and so forth, starting to develop community resources, purpose-built mosques and temples. You start to see that happening, but in very, very unlikely places. Planning was implicated, as in the picture on the far left, in identifying sites that obscured mosques from sites. So this is a mosque. It's formerly called the President Saddam Hussein Mosque in Birmingham. Surprise, it's no longer called that since 2003. It's just the Jami Masjid in Handsworth. But it's visible and invisible. At one street level, it's very visible and clearly distinctive with its dome, and it now has a minaret. But in another way, it's obscured by a flyover, and that was clearly referenced in the planning discourse and the planning approval for this site at that point in 1978. Motoring the story forwards in Birmingham through a very checkered history of appeal cases and Muslim groups fighting, head on, planners trying to resist their efforts to to set up purpose-built places of worship, you start to get procedures like this. So that the second on the left, this is a picture of a mosque, the Central Jamia Mosque, Gamkol Sharif, a very major mosque in Birmingham, set up in finished in 1997, which was deliberately cited as part of what I said before about using sites to celebrate multiculturalism. The planning discourse actually refers to this as an icon for the city of Birmingham, to celebrate Birmingham as a diverse city of multicultural incorporation. And this was the parlance at this time down to the year 2000. However, it's a bit crude the way I'm juxtaposing these things, but these are cases that have been live in recent years. The second in on the right was a far right demonstration in opposition to the Dudley Central Mosque, which was finally concluded against the Muslim group in 2015. It was highly politicized. The planning discourse is largely about belonging and positioning Muslims as other and as not being full citizens of Dudley or of Britain. As I say, it became a focal point for national, nationally focused far-right organizations. And that failed finally at appeal. And then in 2016, this was a mosque proposal in Greater Manchester. This is a response in opposition to that, which ran through fairly typical planning issues in terms of impact upon amenity, impact upon local character, and so on, traffic generation, but also went as far as saying that this mosque would be a security risk. And again, that's linking to the issue of the fear of Muslims and mosques becoming implicated in radicalization. It taps into that shifting discourse in more recent years. So I'm just going to bring this to a conclusion. I think the story is already clear from what I've been saying. In a way, this is a depressing tale, isn't it? I mean, it's a dispiriting tale at one level. Hopefully, because it's trying to dig deep. Hopefully, then more positive things can come out of it and less superficial things. It's a tale then of stalled progress and apparent reversals around race and a progressive anti-racist agenda from perhaps one of the less glamorous fronts of politics and the politics of race in Britain, i.e. planning. This is not criminal law or migration law, but still, we argue a very, very important area of British institutional and political life. And it poses the question then, for us, how deep are the roots of racial thinking and racism, and what are the implications of that for planning? What it tells us, what CRT, critical race theory, tells us is that race, as I've been saying, runs very deep. What we saw as the makings of a progressive anti-racist agenda, whilst perhaps well-meaning, well-intentioned, were clearly not deep-seated. They were superficial. They didn't get beyond the topsoil of institutional life in Britain. Tweaks and adjustments and policy fixes are clearly not going to be robust enough to redress the problems we've identified in this book. There are things, of course, that planners can and must do to persist in the long-term political struggle against what we identify as persistent patterns of racial justice. They must continue to embed anti-racism within planning and other agencies. We need to halt the apparent reversal in an anti-racist agenda in a way that's been sidelined or parked in recent times. We need to address the nature of race and racial thinking directly, rather than just glancing past it or residualizing it, or just going back to seeing it as sort of instantial and eruptive. Actually, as we've been saying, in line with critical race theory, race thinking is thoroughly enmeshed and percolates throughout society. We need to accept that and hit that head on. We can't just dodge the issue anymore. Perhaps more creatively, we need to engage in a transfer of power from people in positions of authority, including in planning, to pass that into the hands of the groups and the individuals who are experiencing racism and who are treated unjustly as a result of racialization, and avoid at all costs rationalizing racial injustice as if it's something that can be just reasoned away or made light of or made excuses for. And we should, as per the earlier discourse of valorizing multiculturalism, we should actively seek to preserve and enhance the forms of life that challenge the racialization of social relations, and continue to invest in the value of that, rather than pursue this more narrow assimilationist agenda that just makes everybody equal before the law, as if that's going to service the interests of equality more generally. More general points: there's a need to give greater emphasis to collective action within planning, first of all, so in terms of professional networks and coalitions, but also perhaps working co-productively with the members of racialized communities themselves, in ways, as I touched on before, that valorize community, that recognize community agency. You know, many of the most progressive changes that have happened, and with some lasting consequence, have come as a result of community group mobilization and agency, not in a top-down, sort of policy approach. So we need to get back to recognizing that and working with that in a way that hopefully can begin to turn the corner and reflect this agenda of deracializing our cities, making our cities more just and more fair, and deracializing planning. And I will stop and leave it there, and hopefully we've still got plenty of time for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you. This striking and important presentation. I always taking some notes. Some of them were questions and some of them were notes for my research. So I always be your friend and also student, because these are so important for me. Let's give the words to Hugh. Thank you again, Hugh, being with us today. And I would like to give you the floor, the Zoom floor, and for your discussion. Thank you.
Right. I'm conscious, actually, that I mean, Richard and I have worked together for quite a little while now. Even though he is such a young chap, you know, it's been still quite a few years that we've worked together, and so a lot of what he said is also what I would they're also my thoughts, you know, on this subject. So what I thought I'd do, because I think it is good to give it an opportunity for people to ask questions and for us to respond to them if we can. I thought I'd just make one or two additional points that are not necessarily tightly connected to each other, but do or supplement what Richard said. One point is to do with planners themselves as professionals. I'm conscious when I make these remarks, by the way, that I'm talking about a very distinctive political and institutional context, which is the British context, and not everything I say may translate, as it were, directly to the experience of a different audience. And if it doesn't, then of course, you know, ignore it. But for what it's worth, I'll give you the benefits of my experience and so on over a number of years. One of the really striking characteristics of the way British planning and the British planning system has engaged with this issue of racial inequality and racism and discrimination and so on over a number of decades. As I say, one of the striking characteristics is the consistent refusal of the vast majority of British planners to recognize any direct significance for planning of race equality. That's to say, countless surveys and pieces of research have consistently found planners saying, we don't see what the relevance of this issue of equality is for what we're doing. And I mean, this has continued. You know, Richard charted the arc, as it were, of the politics, the racial politics of planning, you know, over 50, 60 years. Throughout this period, planners themselves, they've responded, of course, to changes in legislation, changes in regulations, and so on. But when they themselves, as it were, as individuals or as groups of individuals, are asked about race equality and planning, their response overwhelmingly has been, we don't get it, as it were. We don't understand what we're supposed to be doing, what the connection is. And this despite, as Richard was pointing out, clear spatial dimensions. I mean, in part, one could say, well, it depends how you define planning, and different jurisdictions define planning more or less narrowly, Sometimes it's to do quite narrowly with design and building and so on. Sometimes it might include social planning of various kinds and so on. And obviously those considerations may have a bearing on how planners are going to respond. But, I mean, on almost any definition, if you could show that a group of particular groups in the population are finding it systematically, consistently more difficult to get planning permission for their places of worship than other groups in the population, if you can show that there are spatial patterns in housing provision and so on and so forth, I mean, then surely planners on almost any definition, should be at least curious about these things. But British planners haven't. And in part, this is because I'm not excusing them, but I do understand it, because fear and anxiety is a very common human experience, and it's not a pleasant one. And planners as professionals become very anxious about issues which are highly politicized. And one reaction is to try and ignore them and try to distance themselves from them, because if something is very politicized, you can almost never do the right thing if you're a bureaucrat. What the right thing this year may be the wrong thing in 5 years' time, and the people that you upset this year will remember in 5 years' time. And planners, at the end of the day, are workers. They're doing a job. They have lives to lead. They have houses that they need to be able to live in. They have to buy food. They have to, they're people, really. And so, as I say, I'm not excusing them, but I am understanding them. And when one wants, what it means is that when you want to change, you have to think of strategies which are not just technical strategies, planning policies of various kinds, planning processes of various kinds, but you also have to think of strategies that will give the workers who are going to devise and implement these the confidence to do this. And that means essentially giving them confidence in their workplace. It means helping them to, as Richard said in one of his slides, to work collectively, to have create coalitions of support. It means taking seriously the anxieties of people who might find themselves caught up in slightly uncomfortable or very uncomfortable sometimes circumstances. Of course, these people also need to show some courage. Otherwise, why are they doing this job? So as I say, I don't want to be too understanding, but we also have to be practical. Bringing about social change, bringing about some kind of progress, social progress, and stopping it from being reversed is essentially a practical project, and so we have to be practical here. So I thought I'd add that. The other thing which I was going to say is that in this area, you know, we use various terms. I mean, diversity and so on. One of them, which Erhan, you mentioned in an email to me once, was social cohesion. And all I'd say is, I mean, again, these terms don't always travel anyway, and so maybe this is not an issue, you know, for the particular audience, the particular group that I'm now, as it were, part of this evening. But social cohesion is a term that's really best avoided. I think if we can avoid it entirely, then best to just avoid it entirely, you know, and just look at and examine the phenomena that you are interested in. If those phenomena might be endemic violence in a particular community between identifiable groups, for example, or it might be discrimination and inequalities in particular labor markets or housing markets or whatever, or it might be a particular spatial distribution of population, whatever, you know, look at those, and if for whatever reason they're problematic, then deal with them, you know. But social cohesion itself is not necessarily a helpful term. I mean, if one remembers, you know, that you can have very cohesive workplaces, for example, in the sense that they can be completely calm, completely quiet, and utterly exploitative. You know, I mean, social cohesion can coexist with gross inequalities and injustice. For example, you know, a cotton plantation in the United States in 1860 could be on some days a very cohesive place, in the sense that the slaves would be quiescent because they daren't be anything but, you know. So the term itself is so slippery and tricky and ambiguous that I counsel against using it. But I mean, there are other things I could say, but I'll stop there, I think, and we'll just respond to questions. That's okay. Yeah.
May I ask something about last point? I would like to ask you, there's a argumentation about cohesion and integration. Do you think some differences between these two terms? Because in Turkey, while the big migration, mass migration from Syria or Pakistani, these two terms, as argued by some NGOs, some of them were supporting the integration, and the others refusing the integration as a term and policy. They prefer cohesion. And also in Turkish, they created new words to explaining what should be the good formulation to living together. So what do you think about these conceptual argumentation?
Okay. I mean, I could, Rich, I'm happy to make a first, yeah, I know, suddenly Richard is startled, you know. No, it's just that I know you've had thoughts about this, but I'm happy to.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I share your, I mean, I was smiling just because I like listening to you, but I was also smiling sort of Riley, in terms of what you said about cohesion, because I share absolutely your, with all the caveats you set out with in terms of cohesion. Maybe its loaded nature is because of its specific use in the British context. I mean, it really is a stigmatized term by people, well, people of the left, but people critical, people like us, I guess, because of how it was, you know, linking back to the slides. I mean, actually that period post 2001, that shift that I talked about from a kind of a soft, not very well thought out, but, you know, sort of pragmatic articulation of multiculturalism, was to an argument of cohesion, because that was seen to be something that was lacking, and which was a kind of perhaps a euphemism for assimilation. You know, this idea that, and it was about minorities, that they should assimilate. They should, you know, where we lack cohesion, it's minorities are not cohering with us, the British. You know, I mean, it encoded otherness and racialization. But also I think your point's much larger and broader than that. Perhaps, you know, cohesion, you're right, is it's shifty. We can have cohesion under very, very unequal conditions. So who and what does it serve? So I think in terms of the verses, I mean, we could do this like algebra. I think I would just strike through, the cohesion part, and then that brings me to integration. And again, it really kind of means it is also a shifty term, but I think it is a term with sufficient definitional work that has some purchase. It was the case in that period in the early 2000s that cohesion and integration were kind of being used in an underinformed way, as equivalent for each other. If you look at the more sophisticated sort of social scientific, social geographic language around that, I would think of people like Kerry Peach, who wrote a lot about integration, where, for example, you can have high levels of economic and professional integration, but corresponding without any contradiction with high levels of cultural autonomy and integrity in terms of relative degrees of spatial congregation. Segregation is the wrong word in that context. So integration could be segmented. When we talk about integration, do we mean that kind of integration, which could be something that we would foster and even celebrate in that way of celebrating multicultural differentiation that allows, in a liberal multicultural society, a degree of freedom and autonomy to organize the life worlds of cultural groups on their own terms, but also promotes and removes any barriers to economic, professional, educational, political integration. And those things happen under particular kinds of political condition. Or is integration a euphemism for assimilation? And that's the shiftiness of that term. It tends to get elided with assimilation, where it really means we want you to be like us because we're not comfortable with your difference. Integrate. People will use integrate in that harder, it's a totally different sense of the term, actually. So it requires some definitional work to understand exactly what we mean by integration. But I think in a sociologically informed way, it can be something to even aspire to. It's the kind of thing that Will Kimlicka, I don't buy into his theory fully, but multicultural citizenship is defined in his book by that name in those ways. To encapsulate the argument, and I'll give it the floor back to Hugh. The way to promote liberal citizenship in that model is to recognise that we can promote the interests of individuals more fully if we recognise their embeddedness in social structures and social aggregations in cultures and communities. Whereas if we deny that or take that kind of hard top down, kind of the French model, if you like, dare I say, of citizenship, which eviscerates any recognition of community belonging, then obviously we're making that harder for ourselves. So integration in that model could be a good thing, could be something to foster. I'll stop there. Pass back to you.
Yeah, but that kind of integration that, and this is what's really significant, I think, for the kinds of context you were talking about, Iran, is the kind of integration that Richard was mentioning there requires quite often some quite substantial changes in the in those institutions that are accepting, if you like, or willing to go down this integrationist path. That's to say, employers, schools. Integration can't just be about, we allow a distinction between private and public realms, essentially. We allow you to do what you like at home. You can be as whatever, as whatever, Christian, Islamic, whatever, as you like. But when you come into the workplace, these are the rules of this organization, which, for historical reasons, will simply reflect actually the dominant, kind of ways of thinking and ways of life of that country, whatever it is. you either accept them or you don't. But we're willing for you to accept them, and then you'll get promoted the same as everybody else will, as it were. Well, that isn't, that isn't what we're talking about here. We're actually talking about those organizations changing the way in which they think and work, and in quite significant ways. Actually, it would have to be really very significant ways. So it's quite a task, really. Quite a task, it seems to me. But yeah, but it could be. It can't. Yeah, it can be a path, at least, that institutions go down. Yeah, I think. Yeah.
Now I have many questions. I wrote them on my paper, but we have some questions from our audiences. So maybe I can add some comments about presentation and discussion part. And then I will share with you the questions of our audiences. I think, thank you both of you again. Now we should take some lessons from UK to Turkey, because we have some similar problems, but our legislative framework is different from UK. For example, I remember during my research in UK, David Shankland was the head of the Royal Archaeology Institute, or whatever. Maybe I'm wrong about the name of the institute, but Archaeology Institute. So he said that he was a researcher 20 years ago in Turkey about Alevi community, so he knows Turkey. And he said that you have religion policy in Turkey, but we don't have in UK. So some of the problems are coming from there. And I translated into my research that comment like defining religious group. I'm talking from the perspective of urban planners and urban planning side. Defining the groups is creating a problem, maybe, or respecting to what they are is maybe the solution of this approach, these problems. Like what kind of problems? We have some discrimination problems on public space. We have some expression of identity problems on public space. So when we try to define the social groups or cultural groups or minority groups, maybe we create our own problem. Is it problematic way? And related to that, I would like to add Richard's figures. There's a question, another question for UK, because when I visited the UK, I tried to understand the census data, but I couldn't find the Turkey origin people there, because they were defined in the census data as white other. So I couldn't define them religiously or culturally. So I thought that the UK census data is too general. And there are some groups, categories, but they only define categories according to their perspective. But there is a diversity in diversity. So I think the nice concept is super diversity, because Turkey origin people has diversity in it. So the last year or this year, the big campaign was, please write your religious identity on census forms. The Turkey origin people were trying to insist on their people write their religious identity on census gathering documents. So please write your identity as Alevi. Please write your identity as Sunni or whatever it is. So there was a campaign because they suffered from unrecognized groups in UK. I mean about the census data, but they have their rights. They opened their place of worships. They say that we feel equal in public space here. So they don't repeat some problems in Turkey, but they say that we couldn't recognize ourselves on census data because we don't write there the correct definition of our identity. maybe it is long, but there are two questions to you. And I will share with our audience's questions after this.
Shall I say something?
Yeah, go ahead, you. Yeah, I'm still scratching my head. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I mean, the first question, the one about does defining the group create the problem, as it were? And I think the issue here is, it's a consistent, it's an unavoidable kind of dilemma of addressing inequality. It isn't simply something to do with the social groups you mentioned. It's to do with addressing any kind of inequality, gender inequality, for example, and others. If we start with the reality of the inequality, if we accept that there are the inequalities and injustices that exist, then the only way, as it were, to identify them, at least initially, is in the terms within which they are, as it were, constituted. That's to say, if one group of people is, albeit as Richard was pointing out, unscientifically and so on and so forth, but nevertheless operationally, day to day, identifying a particular segment of the population, in the way they live their life, as it were. They divide the world up into particular groups of people, and then they act on those beliefs. Then that's a social reality that we can't begin to do something about until we, as it were, we name it, if you like. And then we can begin to discuss it and so on and so forth. And the ultimate objective may be to dissolve those categorizations, I think actually in terms of race as an idea, I think, that's a very long-term project. But particular racial distinctions, actually, where the boundaries of racial groups go, those are extraordinarily fluid in, not just in British society, actually, but in all sorts of, and actually groups, like Turkish people and Irish people and so on, Jewish people, oh my goodness, they over time, you might, in census classifications, they were white either, now, but I can tell you in day-to-day, as it were, discourse over decades and decades, those groups, those particular sort of national stroke ethnic groups have gone over, one side of a boundary, then another side of a boundary. Honestly, it's depending on geopolitical factors, all sorts of things, So these are very fluid sort of boundaries, really. But at a particular time, unless you, how are we to get, sort of parity and equality for women in the workplace, for example, unless we say, well, we need to count how many men and women are in senior positions, So, and you have to accept the social realities, I think, and that's a dilemma. Even though in so doing, you run the risk of consolidating these groups. That's just a risk, I think, and a dilemma of progressive politics, so on. But classifications, including those ones, are for a purpose. And census classifications are for a purpose. So, you don't just, there's nothing essential about the classifications we use. So you just have to think, well, why do we need these classifications? And if there's a good reason, then you define them and use them. But otherwise, you don't, and you don't worry, it seems to me. But anyway, Richard, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Can I just share my screen briefly? That this is
Yes.
so this is the question on ethnicity, so-called ethnicity, of course, in the UK census. And the format of the question is very telling. You know, we call it ethnicity, but it actually is a euphemism for race. These are racialized categories, you know, because you have these nuanced subcategories, but then they collapse and aggregate into these. You have a white, you have an Asian British. I'm going to be crude here. This is a brown group. This is a black group. This is a white group. When we talk, you know, it gets even more shifty when we talk about mixed. You know, are we talking about mixed ethnicity or mixed race? You know, it's really, you know, and it's, you know, it's murky. And then there's some good literature on this. So a guy as an anthropologist, he's retired now, but Roger Ballard, who's written some very, very important analyses that essentially, through a deconstruction of the way the question has evolved and the way it's formatted, show this is a euphemistic, you know, sort of race set of race categories, and it has a colonial origin. Why did we, in the census, in British statistics, particularly emphasize Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, or African Caribbean, and so forth? It's because those were the, you know, those were the identities that were enmeshed within the British imperial British colonial project.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So you know, I mean, it has a particular origin, as Hugh says, it doesn't have a clear logic. You know, it's a mix of things. It clearly has a racial underpinning, and you can see that by the A, B, C, D, E. It's got some pragmatically added issues. You know, groups we didn't used to enumerate Arab, but it's because that group has grown in number, then we should probably have a category. We didn't used to enumerate the mixed group, but it became very clear that demographically this is hugely important. You know, the really growing, in quotes, ethnic group or groups are the multi-ethnic group or groups. So, you know, but then of course you know, in terms of these broader racialized distinctions, we're also talking about ethno-national, you know, Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, using nation state terms, you know, and then of course they get hyphenated. So it's a mishmash of things. It's not a logically consistent classification. It's a pragmatic fix that builds on a fundamentally racialized base that is itself tethered to the imperial legacy. So you know, in many ways it's indefensible, but just as Hugh has said, it does serve a purpose. We can analyze, and this is where it came from. I mean, you have the 1976 Race Relations Act, which is the first moment in the UK that we start to talk about indirect discrimination. In legal terms, what it means, rather than just talking about direct discrimination, which is palpable, observable, instantial moments of racism, we can start to talk about, you know, patterns of distinction that are not observable to the eye, but which involve aggregates. So the definition of indirect discrimination is where you pass a rule or condition where the proportion of groups that can comply, if they're from a minority group, is smaller than the proportion of the wider group that can comply. It's a proportional distinction. And the only way that you can measure that, literally to measure that, is if you've got statistics, if you've got groups where you can see if a rule or condition is passed, is the proportion of the minority group that can comply smaller than the proportion of the wider population can comply. So the only way they could operationalize that new concept of indirect discrimination from 1976 was to have social statistics. And the first time there was going to be a question on ethnicity or race, but ethnicity in the census was 1981, but there was a backlash against it and it was parked. So there isn't a question on ethnicity in 1981. That was the closest census in time to that race relations legislation. So the first time was actually 1991, where a bit more promotional work managed to get it through. So, you know, but of course it involves reification, and I prefer Hugh's word, actually, consolidation. You know, you end up creating the groups that you kind of, you know, you sort of reify. I can't think of another better word than that, but, you know, that you articulate through social statistics. It produces the reality it's trying to reflect, and there's ample evidence of that as well. So it is just a double bind. There isn't a way out of it. I mean, I've always tended to defend the inclusion of these data because, as Hugh says, you can measure these things, and then you can assess the impact of policies that you couldn't in their absence, and ideally work towards their abolition. Of course, we're nowhere near that as yet. In terms of, so that's the first question, a very long rambling kind of way. But the second question, it follows the pragmatic issue. It is just a question of group size, really. It's just horrible to put it so bluntly, but that is, I mean, in terms of the devising and testing of new questions, it comes down to how big is the group, and therefore do we need a category. There's also consistency over time. So the other thing about the way these questions are where you start to get, we didn't in 1991 disaggregate the white group. You didn't have all these salami slices of for English, Welsh, Scottish. It was a broad white category. But again, because other categories were clearly important, particularly other whites, given EU enlargement at that time, it was important to be able to count. But they're collapsible. You can collapse them back in and fold them back into the earlier categories so that you can get some time series comparing across censuses, so that so that also puts a constraint on any new categories or questions that are added, that there will always be an attempt to make comparability across censuses for time series analysis. So it comes down to a pragmatic fix, really. And I to put a personal biographical hat on it, when we filled in the 2021 census forms for my little boy, we had to decide, well, because he's half Turkish, what, and of course he had no say in the matter, where do we put him? We weren't sure, I think we put other whites and then wrote in Turkish, British, Welsh, I think.
They will decide, maybe.
Yeah. So, it's a pragmatic, it's a totally compromised pragmatic issue, but defensible because it works. Very imperfectly, it helps to work towards the agenda of anti-racism and policies that necessitate measurement, really, but it's not theoretically very defensible.
And we have some questions from audiences, 3 questions, and I would like to read them in Turkish, and our translators will help me. The first one, Türkiye'de, ilk soruyu okuyorum. Ayhan Erdoğan soruyor bu soruyu. Kendisi aynı zamanda bizim Şehir Plancıları Odası'nın genel sekreteridir. Türkiye'de son 10 yılda savaş ve farklı politik sebeplerle milyonlarca insan Türkiye'ye göç etti. Kamusal hizmetlere erişimde çok ciddi sorun yaşıyorlar. Yer yer ırkçı tepkilere de maruz kalıyorlar. Bu noktada plancıların mesleki pratiklerine dışlayıcı, ırkçı davranışları yeniden üretecek politika ve mekan üretimini sağlamamak dışında yapabilecekleri nelerdir? Ben buna bir şey daha ekleyebilir miyim? O da belki Hugh, senin özellikle RTPI ile bir geçmişin olduğunu da biliyorum. Bu konuda önemli çalışmaların olduğunu da biliyorum. Belki buradaki şehir plancıları odasına da tavsiyelerin olabilir. Yani hem şehir plancısına hem de şehir plancıları odasına dönük neler yapılabilir diye genişletmek istiyorum bu soruyu.
Yes. Yes, this is a really difficult issue, I think, that's been raised here. But it is just a very challenging one. I will have some suggestions, but one thing I will say, I was slightly critical of, I was critical of planners earlier about, as it were, their continuing apparent inabilities to see the link between planning and matters of equality. But on the other hand, I should also say that, I mean, planners cannot be expected and shouldn't be expected, to solve problems and issues which are social, societal problems. That isn't to say that they can't contribute to the solution, but they can, they're not superhuman and can't be expected to bear the complete burden, as it were, of problems which afflict a whole society. I mean, in relation to what you were saying about migrants and accessing legal services and so on, I mean, there have been attempts periodically in the UK to give some advice to groups that can't afford I mean, obviously the circumstances in the UK are slightly different, very different actually in some respects, but there are plenty of groups in the UK that for financial reasons as much as anything else, but also sometimes linguistic reasons, not being confident to use English, for example, in their day-to-day lives. These are groups that also find it difficult to access professional advice of various kinds, legal advice and so on and so forth. And in those circumstances, groups of planners have given advice, free advice, specifically on planning issues and legal issues related to planning. Because a professional planner will quite often be quite competent in the aspects of law and procedure that relate to planning itself. They may not be competent in law generally, but they understand enough of the legal context of planning to give advice to a person who knows nothing, And so the RTPI actually has been the Professional Institute of Planners has itself given modest but helpful amounts of money to what it's called planning aid, which is free advice for groups that couldn't otherwise access professional advice. And the Professional Institute, because of its status, has also been able to get other kinds of support, financial support from government, for example, that other kinds of bodies, I don't know, political organizations or particular kinds of charities and NGOs might not be able to access easily. But the professional institution has a different kind of status, if you like, in the eyes of some government departments, and so can access money, which it then gives to planning aid. So that's one kind of response that can be made, I guess. Some planners, independently of the Professional Institute, also give free advice in their spare time, but on an organized basis. In conjunction with NGOs, local NGOs that work with migrant groups or ethnic minorities or whatever, sometimes just groups of impoverished, poor residents. And the planners will give advice to these groups. Typically, they will give the advice in areas where they are not themselves employed. So that, for example, if they work for a local council, they will not give free advice to groups within that council's boundaries, so that there's no obvious conflict of interest between their status as a paid employee of a council on the one hand, and somebody giving free advice to a group which may be in dispute with a local authority. So they'll work outside the boundaries where they have their paid employment, so as to avoid any obvious conflict of interest. But those are examples of things that are done that might be of interest to you.
Thank you, Hugh. The second question, can I ask you, Richard, the second question in Turkish? Zehra Güngördü, bizim doktora öğrencimiz ve meslektaşımız şöyle bir soru yöneltiyor. Öncelikle bu oturumda emeği geçen herkese teşekkür ediyorum demiş. Sorusunu da şu şekilde iletmiş. Belirli etnik kökenden oluşan göç grupları belirli mahallelerde yaşıyorlar Türkiye'de. İngiltere'de de sanırım benzer bir durum var. Sizin bu homojen mahalleler için yorumunuz nedir? Planlamayla ilişkisi nasıl kurulmalı? Ben buna bir şey daha eklemek istiyorum Richard, müsaadenle bu soruya. O da görülmeyen cemaatler, yani invisible communities tehlikesi oluşur mu? Özellikle göçmen mahalleleri gittikçe homojenleştikçe onların görülmeme sorunu artar mı? Kendi içine kapanma sorunu artar mı? Teşekkür ederim.
That's a really interesting question, actually. Can I just check that I've understood in terms of the last part of that, what the question means by invisible communities? Does it mean communities that are, as the presence of particular migrants in neighborhoods grows, that you have, the dominance of a particular group, and you have perhaps existing residential groups becoming eclipsed, or invisibilized by the present? Is that what it means?
Yeah, they live in their neighborhood. We don't touch them, and we don't share a public space with them. But I'm exaggerating the situation, so defining the problematic issue. So the neighborhoods become more homogeneous and more invisible by the wider society.
Oh, it's those neighborhoods themselves. Yeah,
we have that kind of neighborhoods, but it wasn't there. But today we have some well-defined, well-bordered neighborhoods. And so is it a danger? What should we do about this problematic? I mean, invisible community is my definition, but maybe wrong. But there are some homogeneous groups are living together, and they don't have good contact with the wider society.
I understand. So it's the increased homogeneity, but also their invisibility. Okay, so the two things together. I mean, this is the fear element that we had in the UK in terms of growing segregation. This is exactly where, and that fear, rather like the discourse around race. I mean, in fact, that I'm not the only one who's done this. You can track the discourse of segregation, spatial residential segregation, and how it ebbs and flows with the kind of this discourse of race that I mentioned before. At some moments, it's kind of tolerated, even tentatively celebrated, but not so much momentarily as a multicultural pattern. But otherwise, there's deep-seated fear about segregation in UK and other contexts. It's I suppose it is partly understandable. I think again it taps into, in another context, what Hugh was talking about in terms of patterns of understandable fear. But I think that from my point of view, I should probably out myself. I was trained by a social geographer who was very relaxed about segregation, where it did coincide with with recognition of groups, sort of life worlds and ways of going about business, and also didn't coincide with sort of chronic patterns of disadvantage. Unfortunately, the latter is very, very often the case, and perhaps that's really the important issue in the Turkish context. I suppose it's not so much then about the homogeneity. I don't know if we're afraid of a growing presence of groups on in the midst of, or on the edges, the peripheries of our cities, and sort of a looming fear of the presence of that, or is it a concerned fear for the groups themselves? I mean, I'm sure that the situation in Turkey is very, very different to the UK. I mean, is the case of you know, for example, Syrian or increasingly, I guess, Afghan migrants, or even, you know, migrants from other parts of Turkey coming to Istanbul, for example, you know, is the worry about you know, the well-being of those groups, or you know, the worry about the extent to which the city, you know, fabric can incorporate them in terms of infrastructure or even politically. I tend to get worried about the idea that, you know, we should be worried about cultural homogeneity of areas, because that's in the UK context, which is obviously what I know best. That's where the stigma is located. You know, you often get this, you know, fear transmutes into a you know, it's a fear of the other and a fear of the unknown, and it tends to, you know, work its way into a kind of a pejorative characterization of that otherness, of that unknown. So I'm not. I think I'm warding against that kind of. If there's anything intrinsic to be concerned about the homogeneity of areas, you know, I'm not. You know, because what's the alternative? The alternative is, again, you have some sort of, you know, relatively, you know, enforced, you know, sort of dispersal policy to break up areas, which seems to be itself, you know, not necessarily advantageous to the groups that have settled in those areas, if it means it fragmenting, you know, social, informal social support and networks in place and so on. You know, one of the things in favor of a relative degree of segregation is again, in the UK context, is that it's allowed communities who do experience racism and disadvantage to develop, you know, patterns of informal support, and you know, to develop, you know, ways of being that are a, you know, kind of a bulwark against you know, the coldness of the welcome of the wider society. You know, and there is, you know, one of the kind of the, you know, the constraints on the you know, the breaking down of segregated patterns over time is that, you know, as people at the peripheries of segregated areas, you know, tentatively move into new, more mixed areas, that, you know, they expose themselves to, you know, patterns of discrimination and disadvantage. So there's a kind of, you know, as I mentioned before, segregation in the UK is breaking down. You know, you can measure it. There's a on certain measures, segregation increases, but it's purely because you've got a youthful population who are growing in situ. But in terms of movement out of those kind of core community areas in the inner city areas, internal migration into less concentrated areas is happening at a sufficient rate that overall segregation is falling. You know, that's a good sign. That's a good thing, because it means, you know, that people are less fearful. You know, there's more willingness to mix. You know, in spite of some of the discourse of fear around segregation. It's also in part to do with housing markets and so on. But I think I'm not sure I'd be worried about homogeneity per se. I guess I'd be more worried about what it signifies. Really, you know, and if it does, you know, if you've got sort of redlining, or, you know, sort of, you know, measures that kind of block the attempts or the ability of people in such segregated areas to kind of move on if they wish, you know. So I guess it's more a question of the correlates of that pattern of concentration. If it does equate to immiseration, poor housing conditions, lack of job opportunities, and so on, then obviously those are the deficits of homogeneity. But in terms of cultural homogeneity per se, I'm committed to being relatively relaxed about that, coming from an anti-racist sort of perspective, really. But willing to be challenged on that. And I'll pass to Hugh if he's got anything to add.
Yeah. Sorry, Hugh. We exceeded our time. But I would like to share with you the last question. While taking your last sentences, maybe you can answer also the question, because we answered another question, we have another question, but you also answered that. It was very close to the first one. The last question is about, Ayhan Erdoğan is asking again. I will continue in Turkish. Entegrasyon, eşitler arası bir düzlemde yeni bir ortak nokta inşa etmek, ortaklaşa kurallar belirlemek şeklinde tarif edildiğinde asimilasyon problemi çözülmüş olur mu? Bu kamusal istişare ortamında ülkedeki çoğunluk grubun görece avantajından ve göz ardı edilemez üstünlüğünden bahsedemez miyiz? Tüm bu istişare ortamını oluşturan düzlemin sahibi çoğunluk olan grupken. Biraz uzun ve bir cümle, ağır bir cümle. Ben İngilizceye dönmek istiyorum. Hugh and Richard, first of all, I would like to give you the last sentences, and because we exceeded our time, while taking your last sentences, maybe you would like to answer this question, or preferably not. But after that, I would like to thank you again and the audiences. Okay, the floor is yours to you.
Gosh, yes, I'm not quite sure what to say about in relation to the last question. That's constructive. I mean, I don't know if this helps. I mean, I think in this area of planning policy and social policy, which can be quite fraught, you know, it can be quite difficult. I think it really is important that we ask ourselves, as Richard was doing earlier, what is it that concerns us here? You know, what is it that when we're grappling with these issues, which could be to do with the homogeneity of neighborhoods, or it could be to do with particular behaviors in public space or whatever. We just need to try and, as it were, distance ourselves from our anxieties enough to be able to calmly address the question of what is it that is concerning us, and then try to devise a solution to that set of concerns. And I think that's really, really important here, I think, in this area, because it's so, I mean, we're educated and brought up, and all our histories in these different parts of the world, all of that kind of pressurizes us to be anxious and to think in particular kinds of ways about these issues. What Richard said in his slide about going against the grain, as it were, going against the current, if you like, of the ways in which our lives have been shaped and structured, that applies to this topic. And that means it's never going to be easy, but it means you have to stand back a little and not be afraid, and not be afraid of the thoughts you have, you know, because we are the products of our context. We're not perfect. We sometimes think things and then regret what we've thought in a year's time or a month's time. That's okay. We're human, you know, but we honestly do and honestly try to just improve the circumstances. And that means not rushing into something. It means just thinking a little and analyzing and listening, and you know, and then things can improve. That's all I'd say. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And Richard, do you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, like you, I agree with everything he just said there as well, about the sort of the working through our own reactions and anxieties and things. Coming back, and this is a really interesting, complex question, but if I render it in a way that I think you're getting at, does it transform into a question of, must you have equality to achieve integration? And I'm reminded of the kind of classic sort of contact hypothesis, the Allport thesis, that contact between people of different backgrounds can generate meaningful interactions and reciprocity and cross-cultural dialogue, friendships, and networks and so on, but only where there aren't extreme imbalances of power and economics and status. And it goes all the way back to the point that Hugh was making, the language, certainly in the UK context, of cohesion and all that's gone with that, kind of ideas of social capital and bonding and bridging and all this, has tended to kind of, really just wipe a sponge, over all of that deeply entrenched inequality. The idea that if we can just, get people talking and we can bridge and link and so on, then we can create social cohesion, and by which we also mean integration, again in that unthought, untheorized way, but without redressing the underlying problem of deep entrenched inequality, which is what the presentation was about. So I think the Allport, if anyone's familiar with it, the Allport the contact hypothesis, the classic social psychological hypothesis. Yes, contact, encounter, engagement can be very generative and productive and transformative, and understanding between groups can emerge, but only where we've seriously confronted the issue of inequality and the conditionality underlying that inequality, which in this case we're talking about is racialization and its correlates, economic disadvantage, systematic discrimination in the face of institutional practices. You can't have cohesion, or let's jettison that word and hold on to integration, without redressing all of those underlying imbalances of power and parity, and we have to work on multiple fronts, but not least on that, in the image of being anti-racist. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Okay, I would like to thank you, both of you, and special thank to Hugh. During this time, you be with us, and I feel how can I say, I'm so sad for your loss, and I just wanted to say this. And thank you very much. Thank you very much for your contribution to Turkish planning community, because it is very important for us to hear that perspective, because we have some problems to define these issues, and we need to understand from different perspectives. So I think tonight it was very important for our Turkish planning community and profession. So because with the help of you, maybe we can start to think differently about our classical and new problems about the diverse community, and relation to the urban planning issues, and also the inclusive planning techniques. So thank you very much for this. And I understood that I missed you so much. I missed academic discussion and coming together with you. I hope in the near future, we will face-to-face come together and continue our discussion. We will continue to follow you and your publication also. And I would like to thank you both. And if you want to say closing remarks, I would like to give you the words. And then I want to thank to all technical team and our translators. Thank you for your patience, all you guys, and thank you all audiences for tonight being with us. And if you want to say something, Hugh and Richard, I would like to give you the word.
Well, only to thank you all for your hospitality. and your welcome and your questions and interest. Thanks very much indeed. And I haven't forgotten the translators either, who were exemplary. Thank you.
It was an honor for us. Thank you. And Richard?
Yeah, the same. It's been wonderful. I genuinely enjoyed it. I was very nervous to begin with, but kind of really got into it. A wonderful team. Again, the translators and technical team. I was looking. We've got 9 participants here, but then I panicked and realised that there's probably lots listening on the YouTube channel. So it kind of anyway, it was a really wonderful event. Great questions. I really had to scratch my head about those, and I will continue to think about them. And then Erhan, just a personal thanks to you. Really, we've known you for 10 years, and you've been a great friend in that time. And I'm just sorry that I managed to perform all over again my lack of timeliness, my disorderly approach to organisation. But again, reasons to thank you for your patience and and sticking with me. What a great thing friendship can generate to overcome those challenges.
Always.
Thank you so much. It's great to see you all.
Thank you again, guys. Thank you so much. Bye bye.
İyi akşamlar hocam.